Hello, Ledgewood. Welcome to week 18, reading April 23 through 29. We're doing 1 Chronicles 1 through 10 and Psalm 43, 45, 49, 84, 85, 87, 73, 77, 78, 81, 88, 92, and 93. A lot of Psalms, and I understand the impulse to break it up with like one day's reading being in Chronicles, the next in Psalms, one in Psalms. Yeah, I get it. So I wanted to give some background on 1 Chronicles because it is a bit of a different book. The structure of it's pretty different. So the Bible Knowledge Commentary by Eugene Merrill, he talks about how Jewish tradition has considered Ezra to be the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which originally were one book, but much like 1st and 2nd Kings, they were split into two, probably so that the scrolls would be smaller. But the authors or scholars who are looking at these books generally consider there to be just one author because the style, the consistent themes of the work are very, very consistent. And so it really points to like one person wrote all of this and compiled it. And then due to several points of internal evidence, our best date for it is around 400 BC, which is the time of the return from the exile in Babylon. It also cites other books that existed around that time. And there are a lot of different citations in the rest of 1 Chronicles, but the only one that shows up in our reading is 1 Chronicles 9:1, which mentions these other things that are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And I actually think it's different from the books of 1st and 2nd Kings because it's talking about a specific set of genealogies that we don't see in 1st and 2nd Kings. So I'm thinking there was another set of books of the kings of Israel. And it probably honestly wouldn't have been weird for different royal dynasties or just different kings to have had like a new set of history struck to commemorate their reigns, because that wasn't something weird at all. So in the span of the books, we see that in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they start with Adam, which is a lot like in the genealogy of Jesus, where you can see this movement from like Abraham up through Jesus, and then Luke goes all the way back to, like Seth, son of Adam, son of God. And this book builds forward from Adam, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't mention God in the beginning. I couldn't tell you why, but I think that's interesting. So it starts with Adam, and then it goes all the way up to basically the beginning of the end of the captivity of Judah, where Cyrus, king of Persia, declares the people free and declares that they're going to go back and rebuild the temple. So that's the span of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's a huge amount of history, but primary, like most of this is in the very beginning, is just very quick genealogies. Later on, we're going to see a big focus on David's reign and then David's structuring of the religious life of Israel, which, it has its parallels with the way that Moses set up Israel's religious life in the wilderness and then moving into the promised land with no king. And then Joshua is sort of establishing Israel's religious life with, the Levites in every town. And then we see here David is going to be setting this up so that once the temple is built, this place for God's name, which was mentioned in Deuteronomy 12, we're going to have specific people who are going to do specific duties in regards to that temple before it's even built. So you see David in 1 Chronicles is really setting things up for Solomon to be able to be successful in the next generation. So that's kind of what's happening here. We see a lot of different things in the very beginning of 1 Chronicles, because this is going to take us through from Adam up through like a lot of Judah, specifically the line of David. It's going to cover a lot of the line of Levi. And again, it's that focus on David and then the religious life of the people under the sons of Aaron. But we see in the middle of all of this, some important things that are happening. One is the genealogies itself. That's going to come really important later on in the story in the return era, because we see in Nehemiah chapter 7 how they take the people and they're going to check and see, like, where do you fit in this genealogy? Can you recount your father's house, up through all of these generations? And that's going to say whether or not you get to serve in the temple. That's going to say whether or not you get to participate in the sacrifices. And there are actually people who are going to be set apart in Nehemiah chapter 7, because they can't trace their genealogy. And so they actually have to set them apart, and they're not allowed to participate in anything until they can get a priest in to come consult with God about it. So it's really important for them to be able to trace their family tree and prove that they are legitimately of the family of Israel. And so that's some of what's happening here. We also see in the very beginning, we get this line from Adam, and then we have short branches. We have, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so we have, Japheth is probably the eldest. So we have a little bit of his branch, and then we have Shem, and then we have a little bit of the branch of Ham. which is under God's curse there. So we get that. So we get like a little bit of historical context for those, especially for Shem and then his brothers. And then when you move out from there, we're going to see Ishmael and then Abraham's concubine Keturah. So the first one was like basically corresponding to Genesis 10, which this author is using as Genesis as a source. So first there's Japheth and Ham, Genesis 10, and then we move to Ishmael and Keturah, which corresponds to Genesis 25. And then we have Esau and then some of the kings of Edom, which corresponds to Genesis 36. And this is all in chapter 1. And so we're sort of situating Israel among the nations who are her relatives. That's what's going on here. And then we have a couple of interesting names that show up. So there's a guy named Eliphaz who has a son named Teman. This is in 1 Chronicles 136. And then we have a guy named Jobab who's a ruler of Edom, and that's in 144. It wasn't uncommon if you had like a name like Jobab, because you would have in Hebrew, there's the three-letter roots of the word, so it would be JBB. And frequently with theirs, it's like the word heart is levav, so that's going to be LBB is the root, LBB, lebab. And then they would shorten it to just LB, so it's lev is heart. And so it wouldn't be all that strange for a name like Jobab to be shortened to Job. And so there are scholars who think that Jobab might be Job from the book of Job, and Eliphaz, the father of Teman, might be Eliphaz the Temanite. We don't ultimately know, but it's a really interesting possible historical connection. And it also just continues to ground other stuff in the Bible in history. In chapter 2, we zoom in on David's family line, so this helps us see David's kinship to Abishai, Joab, and Asahel, and then later on Amasa, who's going to come up in 2 Samuel 7:15. I mean, it's the problem of working with family, right? This is going to be some of the drama that David runs into, especially with Joab, is this kind of working with family and when your family sort of works against you. And so we see that all these people are out of the family of Caleb, the son of Hezron, who is a different Caleb from the Exodus Caleb. That's Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. But we're going to see this genealogy of this other Caleb go all the way to the Rechabites at the end of chapter 2. And then they're going to come back in Jeremiah chapter 35 in the captivity era. So again, we're just seeing multiple connections between, even from the very beginning all the way up to the captivity with these little details. Chapter 3 gives us David's descendants up through the captivity again. And it also traces both of Jesus' lines. So we have from Solomon to Joseph, given in Matthew 1, and then from Nathan to Mary, given in Luke 3. Both of these lines go from Bathsheba, and that's according to 1 Chronicles 3:5. And so we see that on both sides of Jesus' family, he was descended from Bathsheba. And there's just this shameful relationship with this sort of shameful, situation that is at the root of both of Jesus's lines. So you see Jesus is connected to this shameful story, no matter which way you cut it. So there's a lot of, grace there of the Lord identifying with us in just the shame. We're going to zoom back out in chapters 4 through 5 to cover some lines of Judah. We got one of my favorite Bible names. There's later on in, I think it's in Isaiah, there's Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, which is a whole name. And then in 4:3, you got a girl named Hazalel-Poni. And don't you just want to name your kid Hazalel-Poni? I love it. We also get the sons of Simeon up through the days of Hezekiah. That's in 441. It shows when that sort of runs out. Then we get the sons of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, so the people who were living across the Jordan. We don't get a lot about any of these people, except maybe one or two stories that tell us sort of where they are now. The end of chapter 5 reflects on the fate of these tribes who were taken into captivity under Assyria in 722 BC. And then at the time of the writing of this book, so in the return era, those tribes are still dwelling outside of Israel. So there's a real consciousness of Israel's history, of Israel's ongoing family relationship among the tribes, and then the ongoing consequences of Israel's past unfaithfulness, where they're still carrying out, or they're still living under the judgment of God. Then in chapter 6, we zoom in on Levi's family with the lines of Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. These showed up heavily in the early books of, or the early chapters of Numbers, where they were given all of their different duties. And the Kohathites specifically were to be the ones who were going to carry all of the stuff from the tabernacle on their own shoulders, all the gold stuff that had been covered up by the sons of Aaron. And so they were supposed to be sort of taken care of in that way. We also see a big focus on the children of Korah, and that's really important because Korah was a Kohathite. He was unhappy with the lot that was given to him by God of the kinds of things that God expected from him. And so he rose up against Moses and says, aren't we all holy? Shouldn't we all be able to hear from God? Why can't we be leaders too? And that's where we see, the earth opens up and just swallows up Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and the 250 elders who went along with them. But we see in as Numbers, I think 26, 26:11, that the sons of Korah, the children of Korah, didn't die. And so we're going to see that the sons of Korah move forward in this story, and I'll give a little bit more on that a little bit later. But we see their description of their duties under David and then Solomon, and then the people who ministered alongside them. That's in 6:31 through 43. We also give the duties of the priests, and then a description of their dwelling places, including Hebron, which is where David first becomes king. It's a city of refuge. And then Geba and Anathoth, which are within 5 miles of Gibeah of Benjamin from the story of the Levite's concubine at the end of Judges. So we see that where that happened in Gibeah of Benjamin was within 5 miles of at least 2, really actually 3 cities of the sons of Aaron. And so you see how little influence they actually had on the people around them. Then we move back out in chapter 7 and 8 through the children of Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, the other half of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Asher. And then in chapter 8, back to Benjamin, which is going to lead us to the genealogy of Saul. So there again, we see Jonathan's son Merib-Baal, or he's also called Mephibosheth. So in the book of the Kings, he's called Mephibosheth. And then, I think that's right, and then Chronicles, he's called Merib-Baal. And that's something that you actually see pretty often in sort of in between these books as well, where these people were originally named after Baal. There were authors who then rewrote their names to cover up the name Baal with shame. Bosheth means shame. So instead of Merib-Baal, it's now Mephibosheth. Or Ishbaal, it's now Ishbosheth. And so we see Israel's sort of shame over the fact that we ever named our kids after Baal in the first place. So Jonathan's son shows back up in 8:34. Then we move out to the sons of Korah in chapter 9 again. And so they have this duty as gatekeepers. And so that goes back to Numbers 4:1 through 20 and what they were supposed to do in terms of the tabernacle. In 16, number 16, the rebellion of Korah. 26:11, the sons of Korah lived. And then if you look at Psalm 84, you have this amazing just kind of reflection on like, better is one day in your house than 1,000 elsewhere. Like, I would rather be a doorkeeper at the doors of the Lord's house than dwell for 1,000 years, in the tents of the wicked. And just how does that reflect? If these people are coming from the line of Korah that was unhappy with what God had given them to do, and now you see just such a contentment. And why would they be able to reflect that way on what God has given them with previous generations couldn't? So that's just kind of a neat thing to see that connection. We also see that Samuel is a son of Korah. This is in 6:33 through 38. You can see that line. And then Heman, son of Joel, who is one of Samuel's sons, who precipitated the choosing of Saul. He's one of the important singers in Israel. So the sons of Korah actually wrote Psalm 42, 44 through 49, 84, 85, 87, and 88, which was also specifically written by Heman. And so you see the way that God is actually taking these people who come from, a line that had turned against him, and then he's continuing to use them moving forward in history. And then we have at the end of chapter 9, we go back to Saul's genealogy again. So that's again just sort of zooming us back into the narrative, which is going to take us to Saul's death in chapter 10. And that's moving us again towards this kingdom is being given over to David because Saul was unfaithful to God. And so that's just kind of the flow of this. So some observations. I think it's, to me, as somebody like with a history degree, it's really interesting to see the grounding of the biblical narrative in real history with real documentary sources, real genealogies, real people that, sometimes you look at it and you think, what relevance does this have to anything? Precisely. It was recorded. It was recorded even though we don't necessarily know the relevance. It's not made up. It's just something that was actually recorded. And so that's kind of a neat thing. We see a strong emphasis on Israel's history and relationship to God. We see that he raises up and brings people down. He protects them from their enemies and hands them into their hands to go into captivity. So the whole flow of the story of God's people is actually directed by God. And then when they're reflecting on this, they're remembering that their lives are always in relationship to him. And then we also see there's a lot of grace even in the genealogies. We see a lot of women who are mentioned, which is pretty unusual in the ancient world, still unusual now. We see that the Bible preserves a lot of individual names. Even though we don't know their stories, these individuals matter to God, even in the flow of the larger story, maybe even especially in the flow of the larger story, which is encouraging to me because I frequently feel so small that why would God notice me? We also see this grace that transcends generations, because we see the story of Korah's rebellion that still leads to Samuel, the prophet who raises Israel back up to follow God. We also see the rebellion of Samuel's children that nonetheless produces some of Israel's worship leaders in the next generation. And, like Psalm 84 is just that reflection, so what does this tell us about God? And then I really also appreciate the Psalms of Asaph. He's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 6:39. He wrote Psalm 50 and then Psalm 73 through 83. And I get the idea that he sort of tended to live on like the lower end of the emotional spectrum. And I think it's really good of God that in the songbook of Israel, he includes so many voices. Some of them are voices like Heman that just is, I dwell in darkness, this deep despair. And then you have, Asaph, who do I have in heaven? Whom have I in heaven but you? On earth there is nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Why do you forget me, oh God? And I love that he includes these voices that really are running on the lower end of the emotional spectrum, because it gives us a place where we also can communicate, where we have deep despair about God himself sometimes. And so that gives us real people something to work with as we face life in this veil of tears together. So I hope this was helpful. I know it's really hard reading. It is really hard reading. And so anyway, I hope this helps you to enjoy it and appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great week. Bye-bye.